was walking around outside today and I just thought to myself, man, it's really, really hot, right? And I don't quite remember when it's been this hot for this long. And to me, it's like, okay, we're confronted with this. So what are we going to do about it? But if you've got a whole group of people who are part of a democratic society who deny even that that sort of thing is happening, how can you come up with a solution to it?
That is the voice of Dr. Welton Chang, the co-founder of Pyrra Technologies. Welton is an expert on disinformation, misinformation, and today we're going to explore the relationship between the flow of accurate, reliable information and a resilient society. I'm Roger Sorkin, and welcome to the American Resilience Podcast. So most of the time when we're thinking about producing our films on resilience, we're looking generally at energy, environment, food security. We're asking questions about how can we make these systems stronger against shocks. And the great thing about covering such a broad topic like resilience is really anything that affects people in their daily lives, whatever that adversity, has something to do with our resilience as people and as a society. Information has been weaponized throughout history. Whoever controls the power controls the narrative. We've all heard that history is written by the victors. And so we've seen how misinformation and disinformation campaigns are a direct threat to our civic health and how they can motivate people to act violently. They can reduce the trust we have in our institutions, disrupt our relationships with family members and neighbors. So we thought it would be helpful to explore the relationship between information and resilience and how having a better understanding of how to protect ourselves against bad faith actors who put out information designed to do harm can help us become a more resilient society. And so Dr. Welton Chang is the co-founder of Pyrra Technologies, which monitors misinformation and disinformation, helps clients get ahead of it and insulate themselves from bad actors. And prior to that, he worked as the chief technology officer at Human Rights First, where he founded their innovation lab. He served for nearly a decade as an intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he served 2 tours in the Army in Iraq. And for full disclosure, Welton is also a founding board member of the American Resilience Project. And for all of our films, Welton has been a valuable sounding board and has really helped us think about audience and strategy and how we frame our messages. And so, Welton, welcome to the American Resilience Podcast.
Thanks so much, Roger. Thanks for having me on. And I was going to say that you left out the most important part, which is we've been friends for over a decade. That's the key piece of this, right?
Indeed. And that's a really great concept when we think about resilience, the idea of community building and having these kinds of relationships and trust. And I think really for both you and me in the work that we do, if your audience doesn't trust you, you've failed. And I'd be curious to know, how do you approach this concept of trust in your work when you think about your target audiences?
That's a great way of framing this conversation. I wrote a piece back in, I want to say 2021, called The Great Trust Crisis. And I was trying to draw a parallel to the financial crisis in terms of how institutions that we depended on really let us down in moments where we needed them to perform in the right way. And I see the current information landscape that we live in, and it's not just social media, it's not just traditional media and the things that most people talk about as being sources of information or misinformation or disinformation. But it's also, you talk about relationships, it's also the fact that we are less communal, less bound together as Americans. And I think this weekend's incident in Butler, Pennsylvania, further illustrated this. And this is a trend that's been going on. Robert Putnam's very famous book, Bowling Alone, and I think he has a sequel now where he tries to explain that it's not just even bowling alone, it's gotten much worse than that. I do think that forming those human connections, getting out of the Zoom box, getting closer together as people, that's what's actually going to be needed for us to go back to a place where we can at least trust one another in a way where we can have fruitful conversations. And again, it's not just about the information. It's not just about, oh, you have your facts, I have my facts. That's fake news. This is disinformation. It is about being able to sit down with one another and have that conversation without resorting to violence, without resorting to name calling, without resorting to the things that are not going to be useful for us to advance the conversation.
So you mentioned the events in Butler. We're talking about this just days after the attempted assassination on former President Trump. And we already see there are just the conspiracies are flying, and it's making what was a toxic media environment that much more toxic. What advice would you have for people right now to take down the temperature a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the attempted assassination of the former president should be a wake-up call for people. I don't know if it will be, to recognize that our words have consequences. I gave a talk this weekend at Hackers on Planet Earth, which you can imagine Hope's audience is very much in the First Amendment free speech camp. And I talked about how we use our technology at Pyrra to help organizations that we support, whether they be community-facing NGOs or companies or security firms, to identify things like hate speech. And one of the audience members said, hey, actually, that sounds like censorship. And I said, well, we've long recognized that there are limits to free speech. And those limits are enshrined legally in things like Brandenburg, in terms of, very famously, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, right? That's an incitement to violence. And for a long time, I think we've not held ourselves accountable for the kinds of things that we say about one another. Things that, and I do think that the rhetoric on, and not even just sides, it's just the rhetoric overall about the election has escalated to a point where, again, I'm not surprised that something like this happened over the weekend. And so, it's not, when we say bringing down temperature, I think it's really about kind of focusing and reframing and changing our mental attitudes towards violent speech, towards hate speech, and commit ourselves not to resort to that when we're having an online conversation, or we're having a conversation in front of a school board. Or, I mean, how many videos have you seen over the last 3 years, 4 years during COVID, post-COVID, where people are accusing city council members or school board members of being Satanists and the devil? And right, that's the kind of language that somebody without the impulse control to really recognize what that's just rhetoric, or we don't really mean that they're the devil, taking it seriously, right, and taking action on it in a way that is really just terrible, right? And this is not the first incident. It's so interesting to me that when folks go on mainstream media and talk about political violence, they're able to recite the litany of things that have happened over the last decade and a half in a catalog manner. Gabby Giffords being shot in the head during voter engagement, Steve Scalise getting shot at the congressional softball game, Paul Pelosi being assaulted in his home, where the assailant was actually looking for the Speaker of the House, then Speaker Nancy Pelosi, right? Like, we're able to, Gretchen Whitmer, Governor Whitmer being almost kidnapped. We're able to say all of those things and remember them. And it's not just one thing, it's a whole series of it. We had a period of relative, say, peace and quiet in the country, and now we're in a period where more and more of these things are happening. We need to look at that and say, what is it about the way that we relate to one another online and in real life that is causing this sort of thing to be much more frequent occurrence than we'd like to admit.
So tell us a little bit about what Pyrra Technologies does. Start by telling us really how you identified the need for the services that you provide and what kind of companies or organizations or individuals could really benefit from the work that you do.
Yeah, we spun out of Human Rights First. I was the first chief technology officer for the organization. We started building the predecessor technology to Pyrra there largely because, when I was at Johns Hopkins, I was focused on disinformation and specifically foreign interference. What are the Russian bots doing on Twitter sort of challenges. And I think what we saw in doing that work was, wow, a much worse problem is how we relate to one another online when it comes to political speech. How much of it is violent, how much of it is hateful, how much of it is anti-Semitic, how much of it is Islamophobic, right? And so I had the opportunity to start building that sort of technology at HRF, and we kind of observed the lead up to Jan 6. We were monitoring Telegram. We saw a lot of the videos that people were posting where in one video, they're starting off in Florida. They're saying that I'm going to join a caravan and we're going to go up to, outside the Beltway. And the next thing you know, there's a whole bunch of videos of people down at the Ellipse, and, the rest is history. And so we were asked to basically spin out the technology because signals were missed. We thought that there was a market need for a platform dedicated to monitoring the social media platforms that aren't Facebook and Twitter, essentially, X now. So today we're almost 3-year-old company. We work with something close to 40 different organizations, ranging from Fortune 500 companies all the way to major anti-hate organizations. We probably work with, in some way, shape, or form, every major anti-hate organization that you've ever heard of, both nationally and internationally. We work with different security firms. We work with other software companies to provide our data to them and their clients. So this is an area that we both feel very passionately about. We thought there was a market need, so we turned it into a venture-backed startup. But really, at the end of the day, for us, it's about making sure that we are keeping folks safe from the kinds of threats that can be observed on these platforms, right? Whether they be direct death threats against Supreme Court justices, other politicians, all the way to kind of private citizens who just get caught up in conspiracies and the kinds of disinformation that were previously reserved for people like heads of state or governments, right? Those same tactics are now being used against, I would say, smaller, more private entities, whether they be a small company based in Tennessee, right? Say a tractor supply company, for example, or a random employee at a company who just so happens to have taken a public activist stance on some issue. And the next thing they know, they're a 15-minute celebrity, but in a really, really bad way, getting violent threats, physical, messages saying that someone's going to physically assault them somewhere, right, or harm their family. That's much more prevalent, much more common now, I think, than it ever has been.
And how do you help an individual in that kind of situation?
I mean, I think the first thing is just to recognize, where is this content coming from? How serious is it? You're able to kind of deep dive into the users who are posting this sort of content, try to understand, hey, is this person within my proximity? Do they say that they're located in the same state that I'm in? And we have something called a response network. This is a kind of vetted group of companies that we work with who do things ranging from install bulletproof glass at synagogues all the way to provide crisis communications playbooks for different clients and everything in between. So you can imagine maybe it's a physical security need that somebody has. They need security cameras, or they need a bodyguard to accompany them somewhere. You can take all of those actions all the way to, say, scrubbing or removing your private data from data brokerages and other places online, so it's harder for somebody who is nefarious to try to dox you and put your public information out there so that somebody can harm you physically.
So, I've always really been interested in the idea of weaponized information. And that's certainly not something that's new to society. I mean, for centuries, you can even say for millennia, those who control the narrative are the ones who control the power. And I wondered, have you studied the history of the weaponization of information? And do you see any trends that can help us understand this moment? Or are we really in such uncharted territory in this digital social media age that we have to write an entirely new playbook?
Well, untruths are as old as language. I think probably ever since humans have been capable of some form of spoken or written language, we've had both the ability and the desire to say things that are both true and untrue. So, the things that have changed obviously are the technology, the ways in which we can relay this information, how widespread that information can get. I would say probably starting with like the Gutenberg printing press to the radio and obviously television and now the internet. That's sort of been, the medium has changed. The ways in which we kind of think about and grapple with the problem that exists. So, I mean, the history of it, right? The content, you go back to, this is actually quite interesting. If you think about newspapers and how we currently think of newspapers as being, kind of a first cut at history, right? And history being some form of the truth with a small t. In the early days of newspapers printed all sorts of rumors and all sorts of wild, outlandish things, partly for their audience, partly to sell newspapers. Things like, coming from the New World, there's an account from a sailor that they encountered this giant sea dragon, and someone draws a sea dragon, and that's part of the newspaper. It's not always been that newspapers were relied on as being a source of truth, to the point where if they print something erroneous now, people are quite upset about that. The history of newspapers is that, really it was about just kind of getting information out into the space, and that not all of it in there was recognized as the truth. And look, our relationship with these media have changed over time. People were quite upset at Orson Welles for doing the War of the Worlds broadcast because, well, look, you had this relationship with radio where it was conveyed in such an authoritative way that it felt misleading for it to be basically a kind of live action broadcast of the War of the Worlds, right? So, I don't want to bore your listeners with all this history about disinformation and things like that. Just to say that this is something that has been with us for a long time. I think the difference today is a couple of things. The first is that we got used to having kind of three main platforms where we got all of our information: Facebook, X/Twitter, maybe TikTok. You want to throw it in there, right? And I kind of equate that to the world where people got all of their information from the three main broadcast channels: ABC, NBC, CBS, right? You get your sports, you get your news, you get your celebrity gossip, you watch your sitcoms all in one place, right? And Facebook is still sort of like that, where you can get all sorts of information from it. Nowadays, with the explosion of alternative, unmoderated social media, places like 4chan and Acun and Incels and Truth Social and Mastodon, it's much more like cable, where I can get a very specific subset of information. If I just want to watch The Crocodile Hunter 24/7, I can do that. But instead of The Crocodile Hunter, people are doing things like reading up on anti-vaccine theories and, propagating white nationalist ideology, right? That's, in the past, it was much harder to get access to that sort of information. Now you can go on the specific Telegram channel and just kind of ingest it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nonstop, if you really want to. And so That to me is part of the big change. The big platforms also did a lot of moderation, and they still do. Why you don't encounter, even though it's quite prevalent on some of the darker spaces on the internet, child sexual abuse material on Twitter, because they're actively removing that. And they're also actively removing, like violent threats against individuals. There are other platforms that don't take an active role in removing that information. I would say Telegram is one of those places where like basically anything goes. They do remove some things, but it's very, very uncommon. And so these are places where both noxious, terrible things can persist as well as untruths. There's no kind of way to kind of claw that back, to remove it. And so if you're, I don't know, let's just use this as an example because this is about resilience and climate and things like that. Let's say you're a scientist and your work is about modeling the future of the climate. Somebody writes a 2-page thing that says you're actually in cahoots with Nestle or something like that, and they've all this evidence, right? It's all fabricated, and it's in a PDF, and they hang it on this Telegram channel, right? And then it gets copied and downloaded and spread. That sort of thing can live forever, right? Things like the Christchurch massacre, that video, it just lives online now. Even though people have been trying to remove that sort of terrible thing from the internet, it just lives there. So we're in a different world from when we had like chain letters getting sent through the mail, or I don't know, what other quaint thing can I point at, right? We're exchanging recorded fish concerts on tape, okay? Something like that. We're far cry from that, right? So that's the change. The change is the technology. The change is the velocity. The change is the reach. The psychological phenomena is largely the same. Our brains are largely the same. Yeah, it's just there's more of it, and it's more easily accessed.
So there is a sort of insidious formula where a certain political figure will say something like, a lot of people are saying this or that. I'm not saying it, but a lot of people are saying it. And that starts the news cycle for that particular item, which then essentially gets launched into orbit and has this life of its own, becomes its own meme. It was never news to begin with. And so I wonder what, if anything, you or we or together we can do to nip that sort of thing in the bud. Right? It probably places more of an onus on journalists themselves. But as we see from a presidential debate, for example, you can't fact check in real time. It's almost impossible to do anymore. And when you start trying to fact check afterwards, your fact checking becomes buried by the onslaught of new tweets and other information. And so I come back to the rate of information as the thing that gives me the biggest headache, not so much the information itself, but it sort of feels like quicksand. You're trying to claw your way back out to take a breath of fresh air, but you just keep getting buried. And so I guess the question is, how do we do this work and involve the news media in it as sort of a something of a backstop against some of these items becoming getting a life of their own on social media?
Yeah, I mean, this is the key challenge, right? There's the distinction, the line between, and it's so funny to me because I think at a certain point, I'm trying to remember back when, the first time this happened, right, where CNN, they're like broadcasting, and then they put a tweet up, and they start talking about the tweet on CNN, right? And I think back in like 2014, that would have been something sort of unusual, right? Where they're like, oh man, they're talking about a tweet, right? And now everything is just kind of mixed together in one informational soup, right? It wasn't always the fact that like, oh yeah, like, there's the line between all these different media sources wasn't so clear. And for normal people, regular people, I think one of the things to think about is like, what is actually the value to you for being the first to a piece of information? Like you and I right now. Does it matter that either of us are the first or the second or the third to read about something, maybe this Trump attempted assassination, a shooter, they found something in his home or something like that? Does it really matter that we see that first? I don't think so. It doesn't move the needle at all. Maybe it makes us, gives us a little dopamine hit, like, oh man, like I was the first to see that. Like,
well, it helps the news organization make more money when they can say we broke the story.
Yeah, that's a business model problem that I think media has to grapple with. It's almost like we're trying to get a public service, a public good, out of an industry that's still set up to run almost exclusively capitalistically, right? But we look at it and hold it to a higher standard and almost like a utility, and that to me is a long-term unsustainable feature of the information landscape. Is we're probably going to wind up in a world where it's like just the New York Times basically, and then maybe a smattering of a few other newspapers or whatever, and then everything else is gone, right? Everything else is people broadcasting on Twitch and YouTube. But look, I really our focus on speed, our focus on like, oh, I want to be the first to know, this kind of social media addiction that we all encounter, like that's a little bit problematic to me. We don't need to be the first. You don't even need to be the second. It's probably better for you to focus on the things in your life that matter more, your children, your families, your pets, or whatever it is, than it is to focus exclusively on what's happening on Twitter, right? And, there's more and more talk about, I think the Surgeon General wants to classify social media as like, inherently harmful, like cigarettes. I back that. And we all need to re-examine our relationship with our need to have this constant drip of information and ask ourselves if it's 1, helpful, 2, valuable, 3, necessary. And maybe that's what can bring us back from also potentially being the first to retweet an untruth or misinformation or be a patsy for propaganda, right? Like there's all sorts of negative things that come out of that kind of that need for speed.
So, as you know, we're the American Resilience Project, and when we started making these films, we mostly had a focus on energy and environment. And this concept of resilience, it really is such a wide umbrella to cover so many other issues. And that certainly makes my job easier because really anything goes. You can almost put anything having to do with the well-being of individuals in society under this concept of resilience. And it's looking at the strength of our institutions, our public health, the cleanliness of our water, our economy, our infrastructure. There are resilience efforts that we can take to strengthen all of those things to make us a more resilient society. And I wanted to have you on to talk about this in terms of communication and information specifically. And if you can help us draw the connection between how a healthy and reliable, trustworthy flow of information, a healthy consumption habit of information can strengthen our institutions and strengthen ourselves and make us all more resilient.
I mean, it's critical. It's the foundation for how we navigate the challenges that are ahead of us. If we can't agree that something as impactful as climate change is actually happening to this planet, how can we agree on the necessary measures to take to prevent catastrophe? That to me is the key challenge. When people ask me, as somebody just asked me this recently, what do you see as the worst thing that's potentially going to happen to us? Like, what's the biggest problem that I should try to tackle? It was a group of college students. And what I said to them was, yes, from a existential standpoint, things like AI risk and climate change, those are extremely important to work on, and I hope that people will focus their careers looking at that. But a more proximate challenge that we face is that people say things like, oh yeah, you have your own sets of facts, I have my own facts, right? So there's a selective use of facts, there's the twisting of facts, there's using facts to generalize into a whole scenario that can't be generalized to, right? It's just kind of misuse of information, whether it be truthful or not. And that is going to get in the way of adoption of any kind of solution to, for example, curbing AI risk, or deciding that we need to build a seawall or do some other kind of extreme measure to, keep us safe from things like extreme heat. I mean, I was walking around outside today and I just thought to myself, man, it's really, really hot, right? And I don't quite remember when it's been this hot for this long. And that, to me, it's like, okay, we're confronted with this. So what are we going to do about it? But if you've got a whole group of people who are part of a democratic society who deny even that sort of thing is happening, how can you come up with a solution to it? And so, look, this isn't about trying to arrive at truth. It's about trying to arrive at a set of principles that allows us to have an informed debate, conversation that then may arrive at some form of truth, right? But those ground rules are increasingly contested. It's kind of mushy even, right? Like what counts as evidence? Going back to the start of our conversation about the assassination attempt, I've heard from so many people in the last 48 hours that they believe that the shooting was staged and that, it was fake Hollywood blood and all these different conspiracy theories. And you kind of have to ask yourself, like, okay, the First Amendment protected speech, people can say all sorts of things that they want to say, right? But your personal responsibility to confirm and check those things and to kind of interrogate some of those beliefs before you kind of say them out loud. People don't feel embarrassed anymore, really, about like getting caught spreading disinformation. They just kind of chalk it up to like, oh yeah, well, it just happened, right? We should feel embarrassed about that because we don't want to perpetuate the problem. We want to be a part of the solution, right? So when people say things like, oh, it was Hollywood blood, okay, like where that, and I read a few things people were saying, like, you hear how he was obsessed about getting his shoes on, talking to the Secret Service about getting his shoes on before he rushed off stage. Well, he kept the blood in his shoe and he took it off to get the blood, and that's why he wanted to get his shoes on. And just kind of like, guys, like every single one of these steps you take in leaps of logic just makes things more and more implausible. But again, that's the sort of thing that's happening, and it's hard. It's hard to push back on. It's hard to even determine, what's truth and what's not. And the challenge as well is that we've lost a lot of faith in our institutions, folks who should be providing us with that source of information, authoritative information. There are so many competing sources of information as well. Institutions have been caught lying about lots of things, and you want to, go back in history, look at Tuskegee, right? And it's disproportionately impacted certain communities, whether they be minority communities or the LGBT community, right? Let's not ignore that those things happened, but we need to have a recognition, have an understanding that sometimes these institutions do have our best interests in mind. And yes, they can screw up. They're made of humans. Humans make mistakes, but they're still trying their best to give us the right information to move forward with our lives. So,
well, Welton Chang, thank you so much for joining us today on the American Resilience Podcast. And thank you for all the important work you're doing, helping us all make sense of this overwhelming media environment. And of course, thank you for all your help over the years, helping ARP sharpen our films and craft our messages so that we can reach audiences in the most effective ways.
Well, thanks, Roger. Thanks again for having me on. I had a blast. Thanks for letting me ramble a little bit. Hope folks got something out of it.
I've been speaking with Dr. Welton Chang, the CEO and co-founder of Pyrra Technologies. You can learn more about their work at their website, pyrratech.com. That's PYRRATECH.com. And be sure to check out more from the American Resilience Podcast by going to our website at amresproject.org. That's AMRES project.org. And please be sure to help us get noticed by liking us and leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can watch all of our films for free right on our website. And be sure to sign up for our newsletter so we can send you some updates on all of our upcoming films. Please also consider making a tax-deductible contribution to help support our ongoing work. Today's program was produced by American Resilience Project with editing help from Joseph Skinner and music by the great John Caban. I'm Roger Sorkin. Thank you for listening, because civilization deserves a fighting chance.